This simulation, called "Why Would Anyone Do That?", puts your students in the role of detective as they use economic reasoning skills to solve 5 mysteries of seemingly illogical behavior on the part of Soviet producers and consumers. To prepare for this activity, you'll need copies of the 5 scenarios for each student. Copy each scenario on a different color paper. Begin by reviewing the definition of incentives with your students.
In the last activity, we talked a little bit about incentives. And so what are some incentives? Incentives, they can be positive things, they can be negative things. But anything that really influences your behavior and the decisions that you make can be an incentive. So can you think of an example of a positive incentive?
Incentives are rewards or penalties that influence people's behavior. They should have no problem giving you plenty of examples of both positive and negative incentives.
Going to jail, that's a negative incentive. What else? Being fired would be a good example of a negative incentive. Okay? Are prices incentives?
Talk about how prices and profits are incentives in our economy. Prices are incentives for both buyers and sellers. For example, high prices are incentives for producers to produce more and consumers to buy less. Lower prices are incentives for consumers to buy more and producers to produce less. Profits are incentives for producers to produce more. But in the Soviet Union, prices did not change with market forces, and firms were not allowed to keep any profits they made. So prices and profits did not act as incentives in the same way they do in our economy. In the absence of market prices, other incentives were at play in the production and sale of goods and services in the Soviet Union. And that's the job of your students, to discover those incentives and use them to explain behavior that would otherwise seem strange or illogical.
If it's not profits and prices that are motivating people, then what is it that's motivating people? So here is the first scenario that seems to have some perverse incentives at play. Okay? Professor Judy Thornton of the University of Washington reports that when she was...
Complete the first scenario together as a class, modeling what you expect of them for the next scenarios. Scenario 1 examines what incentives are behind excessively heavy lamp bases and nails.
The problem of grossly heavy products was not limited to the lamp industry, however. She recalls a cartoon that appeared in a popular weekly magazine in which the entire staff of the plant was shown carrying a single nail. It was so heavy that everybody had to help carry this nail. And there's a little fill in the blank. Well, comrade, I see that the quota is measured in blank this month. What do you think the quota would be measured in if this is the kind of nail, the kind of output that's coming out of this factory? Weight. If your quota is in producing so many pounds of nails, then wouldn't it make sense to make really heavy nails and not have to make very many of them? And then you've met your quota and your reward and you get paid your rubles, right? What if the quota had been different? What other kind of quota could they have been given?
The second scenario looks at the tendency of Soviet geologists to drill many small, shallow, and ultimately unproductive oil wells. The third scenario investigates the virtual impossibility of obtaining spare parts. And the fourth scenario highlights the grandiose dedication ceremonies that mark the opening of new buildings, even though the buildings were never quite finished. The fifth scenario studies the curious incidents of people buying broken light bulbs to take to work. Divide your class into groups of 4 to 6 students. And if time permits, have each group work on all 5 scenarios. But if you're short on time, you might assign each group 1 or 2 of the scenarios. Have each group appoint a discussion leader, a recorder, and a key question asker who will ask these 2 key questions when necessary. Number 1, have we identified the incentives? And number 2, how is this behavior the same and different from behavior we would expect as the result of the incentives that operate in a market economy?
Try to narrow down, when I give you a scenario, I want you to narrow down who is the decision maker, okay? Who is the decision maker and what incentive does the decision maker face? So if you can narrow those down, it's going to be very helpful in solving the mystery of why would anybody do that?
After they've discussed and answered the questions that follow their scenario, have the group create a new incentive and describe the likely behavior that would result from that new incentive. So what incentives are they facing, and how might this affect? You'll find handy teacher notes for each scenario in the lesson materials, and those notes give you background and information on the incentives that were at play in these bizarre stories. Use this information to ask some guiding questions while student groups are working. When they're done, have each group share their mystery solutions or their incentive explanations with the class.
Okay, what I'm going to ask your reporter to do is just give us, in your own words, a little summary of the weird scenario, and then what you came to as a group, your conclusion, okay? So who are the decision makers at play? What incentives do they face that would help shed some light on why they would do that, okay? So we'll start with this group up here.
So in our simulation, it was digging oil holes into the ground to find the oil. And so instead of awarding them for finding oil in Russia, they awarded them by how many feet they dug. And so instead of digging one long hole, they just dug a lot of smaller holes because within like the first 5,000 feet of the earth, it's a lot easier to dig. And then as you get deeper, it gets harder and more expensive.
When debriefing this activity, return to the concept of incentives and the role that prices play as incentives. Point out a common thread among all these mysteries, that common thread being how hard it is to make decisions regarding what should be produced, how it should be produced, and even how much should be produced when price signals are missing. Quotas are incentives like prices, and they were a common incentive in the Soviet Union, but they resulted in very different outcomes. Putting your students in the role of detective will allow them to discover the major economic concept of this activity, that people respond to incentives in predictable ways. And that is a powerful insight, because the key to understanding human behavior is understanding the incentives that people face.